mentioned, you were talking about, the quarantining and everything that's going on. And
Uh-huh.
Dan and I got a email today from our man in India, Brother Kumar, and
Uh-huh.
he had some. The virus situation is hitting them pretty hard too because they're all day workers there, and I know he specifically mentioned, what was it, Dan? 20 families that uh, are in dire straits, as well as his income has been hit a little bit too. So just want to keep them in your presence. All of in Nigeria, they're experiencing some, but they're really locked down pretty tight in India, and then they're doing online services in Panama as well, at the church there.
That's good that they can do that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So, did I get that right, Dan? I think I heard that on Douglas's email.
Yes. Yeah.
They're doing it online. So
Yeah. And I think India, they're allowing them to just have around 5, if I read that correctly too, that only 5 allowed to meet for their worship service. So yeah, they're in pretty much a lockdown situation also.
Yeah. Crazy times. Yeah, we'll have to keep our eye out on that. Crazy stuff. All right, yeah, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started with our class. And I'm sorry that it's so late into it. This kind of creates a interesting dynamic with everything that we're doing. But we are in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Okay. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And we had gotten through verse 11 in that particular chapter. This entire chapter almost or virtually is on kind of the marriage situations. It does address some other things, which we'll get into in just a minute. But it's primarily talks about the marriage relationship, especially with a lot of the things that are happening with the church there and the things that they're experiencing. And so we're first going to look at an aspect of this tonight that I know affects even a lot of the families within our congregation. Okay, a lot of the families within our church. Okay, and that is husbands and wives, instructions for husbands and wives who are married to unbelievers. Okay, so we're going to look at verses 12 through 16. And so tonight we are going to be hitting some sensitive subjects in the church, and they're sensitive to people just because we've got some that are in situations like that. Okay, and so doesn't mean that we can avoid those things, but definitely can be sensitive. So I'm going to have somebody read verses 12 through 16, and y'all showed me last week, I think, that there is a feature where you can raise your hand. Is that working right now? Because I think since I'm the class leader, I don't have it. Yeah, the Tuttles raised their hand. All right, awesome. So I guess what I'll do is I'll look at the list, or I'll look at your screen, and I guess the first one to raise your hand, you can, if you'd like to read this, I guess that's how we can volunteer. Just raise your hand and you can read that for us. We got any volunteers? All right, Gayla or Terry, one of you two. That's 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 16.
To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, if a brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is happy to live with him, he should not divorce her. If a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is happy to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified because of the wife, and the unbelieving wife because of her husband. Otherwise, your children are unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever wants a divorce, let it take place. In these circumstances, the brother or sister is not bound. God has called you in peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will bring your husband to salvation? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will bring your wife to salvation?
Okay. See what I mean? Fun stuff. All right. So I want us to take a look at this. And first of all, we do see some familiar language as Paul is speaking here. Okay. Whenever you look specifically at verse 12, he says, "To the rest I say," and then of course in the parentheses, "I, not the Lord." Okay, so what is Paul obviously trying to tell us right here before he begins his thoughts, before he begins his next thoughts? And don't forget, if you want to comment, to unmute your mic before you do that. There's a lot to keep up with, I know. All right, maybe I'm asking an obvious question, but just give me an obvious answer. If you
I
feel
take it to mean that he's speaking not as an inspired
Mhm.
or as a command, but more as an opinion. That's the way I take it to be.
Yeah. And we saw some of that in the last couple of weeks, didn't we? You know, we saw him operating that way. And actually, I'm thankful that he does that. I think it makes it easier to understand that, hey, this is Paul speaking, not the Lord. But is there a profound purpose in Paul doing that, do you think?
I think he's probably more in the counseling role. I mean, we sometimes give our opinions based off of biblical, off of scripture or the answers that we would give to someone. It may not be "thus saith the Lord," but it's based off of what we feel is best at the time for their situation. And I think he's probably, as we talked about a few weeks ago or last week even, they were experiencing persecution and that being married is sometimes would be to them at that time a hindrance in some regard. And so I think he's just trying to counsel them and inform them of what might be best in each situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, don't you guys think that, I mean, the church has to make discernments like that today, don't we? I mean, we have to think about what might be right as far as law of the land or culture, but it may not be something that's beneficial for Christians or for the church to be involved in, and it may not have the best influence on others. Okay. And so, you got to think about things in that respect and kind of the environment that you're in, when I'm actually going to bring this up a lot. I've only spent 2 weeks in the country of India my whole life. But boy, I learned a lot of stuff there. And whenever you think about it, as far as eating habits, what is involved in most Indians' diets, or what is absent in a lot of Indians' diets?
Meat. They do not eat a lot of meat, do they?
Most of them don't eat meat. As a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, they did have McDonald's there, but I remember the McDonald's that I saw only served chicken sandwiches. Okay. because they don't eat beef. And they don't eat beef. It's really a religious thing, but it kind of had turned into a cultural thing too. A lot of them believe in reincarnation, and they believe that that in a sense that their relatives, when they die, are embodied in particular animals. Just to give you an example, there were a couple of houses that I went by where the house in and of itself was basically a hut with a grass ceiling on it. Well, behind the house was a concrete slab with a pillar at every corner and then a solid ceiling roof on it. You know what was under that roof? A cow. And so my point there is that cow just about had a more solid structure to dwell underneath than the family did within that house. Okay. Of course, I'm going off on a tangent here, but what I'm trying to say is sometimes we've got to be sensitive to what is best in the current situation. Do you think I would have been very effective in my work in India if I went around eating beef patties? No, I wouldn't.
They would have thought you were eating Aunt Sally.
That's right. Now, the people that
Very popular.
Yeah, the people I was staying with at the time, they were not vegetarians. I mean, they ate whatever they wanted because they were members of the church and they didn't believe that. Now, they did that in their own home. But, whenever they would fellowship or whenever they would try to be an influence on those, from a Hindu background, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't rub it in their face. Okay. And so that was very important. But it also
cast a stumbling block.
Right. Don't want to cast a stumbling block. Now, obviously, I know that we're looking at something very different here, but I think it's important to kind of look at things in the same light. And that is, in this situation where you are married to an unbeliever, what is going to give them any chance of believing? Is it to say, well, you're an unbeliever, so we can't be married anymore? That's not going to bring them to Christ. Okay. Definitely, I think we would agree with that. But what we want to understand from verses 12 and 13 here is thinking about this question: is putting away an unbeliever necessary for a Christian?
I think that's what Paul's saying. He was not given any divine instruction on this. So he's applying some wisdom and trying to give some comfort to folks. From what you were saying, I was looking at 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, where it says, likewise, you wives be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, that they may without the word be won by the conversation or way of life of the wives. Which is exactly what you were just alluding to, was that it's can be the benefit of the unbelieving spouse just to keep them there because you might have a hand in saving and getting them to heaven.
Yep. It goes along with this question. Whether both husband and wife or one or the other is a Christian, okay, one's a Christian and one's not a Christian, or neither are Christians, or both are Christians. Does that change the holiness of the marriage relationship? I want you to think about that question. And I'm getting a correct nod, I think, from Dan. Okay. He's saying, no, it doesn't. Okay. When two people vow their lives together, okay, now I understand that an unbeliever may not vow their life together before God, but they have still committed their lives together. And I believe that God would see that as, a coming together. Okay. But when two people come together in a relationship and they recognize each other as one another's spouse, then they have entered into a relationship that was wholly created by God. Okay, and that's the aspect of it that makes it holy. Okay, Matthew 19 and verse 6. That's where Jesus, talks about the holiness of that relationship. Okay, and I can go there real quick and read that one. All right. It says, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Okay. Again, we looked at that last week. I think it's important for us to view that in light of what we're talking about. Okay. All right. I'm going ahead.
Paul puts the onus on the unbeliever and takes the load off of the believer.
Uh-huh.
In those cases. In other words, it's okay if they stay together, and if the unbeliever splits, that's not the fault of the believer.
Yeah, very good. Okay. So yeah, I like how it's saying, if the unbeliever says, no, you've become this part, at the time it would have been this new thing. Okay. You've decided to become, part of the way or become a Christian. I have no issues with that. That's obviously better than someone saying, I have issues with that. And this isn't going to work. Either you denounce Christianity or I'm gone. That's the scenario that some of them definitely would have been facing. And of course, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. But that's kind of what we're going to be getting into. All right. I want us to think about it too in light of verse 14. Okay. In verse 14 here, again, as was read a while ago, it says, for the unbelieving husband is made holy. Okay, so this goes along with what we were saying. The unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So, what does this mean? I think some people interpret this to mean that if one spouse in a marriage relationship is a believer, then the entire household is saved. Okay. Is that what this is saying? No. What would this verse be saying here? What is Paul trying to communicate to his Christian audience? And again, I'm going to try to look at YouTube also. Sorry guys if I'm running behind on that. Somebody wants to answer that question. What is Paul trying to say here? I can still hear you. I'm going to grab my phone real quick. Sorry, guys. My iPad wasn't picking up the YouTube chat very well, so trying to get in on that. Nobody wants to answer that question?
Well, I'll just jump in here real quick. I think is what he's saying here is that if you were married legitimately under whatever laws or rules or whatever, according to the time that you were married, and you have children, and you have an unbelieving spouse, one or the other, your children are not unclean. Apparently they looked at a possibility of thinking just because they both were not Christians, if they had children, then because one not being a Christian, that there was sin there somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And he is saying it, if you were not Christians when you got married and you had kids and then you became Christians, or one of them became Christians, it doesn't mean that your children are unclean. So the relationship there is, I think, is what he's saying, that it's sanctified. In other words, it's legitimate,
Mhm.
and it complies with whatever marriage laws. And if you did it under that system, then you were considered clean. Like I said, I agree. I don't think that it means that the other spouse is in a saved relationship because one spouse is a Christian. It's just saying that you're set apart or sanctified, holy, so that your family can continue to carry on as a normal family would.
Mhm. Yeah, very good. Very, very good. And if you think about, I mean, well, I'm going along with what Dan said. If you think about it, we often say this, that sometimes we're the only Bible that people read, right? But I might like to say it better as sometimes we are the first. Okay. People, even our family members, some of them, we're going to be their first exposure to a relationship with Jesus. Okay. And I think in that situation where you have an unbelieving spouse and a believing spouse, and even children in that situation, that believing spouse is going to be the representation of Christ in that family. I think it does put some pressure on that one family member. It most certainly does. But obviously,
Yep.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ryan. I didn't want to jump on.
Well, I was going to say, but that means that if we wear the name of Christ, if we wear the name Christian, we obviously need to take that seriously, don't we?
Yeah.
If
And what I was going to say is that too, that when I say the children are in a saved relationship, or what I'm saying is that, I mean, to the point of then understanding what they need to do to become Christians, it doesn't mean, and I don't think we take it that way, that it means that they're totally not responsible for making the decision once they get to that age where they understand what sin is. But
Right.
at the time that they're small children in that family, then there was nothing wrong with them having children or continue to have children because of one or the other not being a Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Very good. All right. Now I want to go to verse 15. And this one has some interesting wording in it. That's taken a particular way that I want us to think about for a second. It says, "But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved," or your translation might say, "not under bondage." Does anybody else's use a different word there? I mean, obviously, they're going to have the same meaning, but some words do a better job of explaining, I think. Nobody else has something different there, right? Okay, so I want us to think about this word enslaved or in bondage. Okay, and what that's really trying to say there. Okay. I think it's probably taking it too far if we bring this in as an argument as far as divorce and remarriage. I don't think that's what the intent is of this particular passage. And so I want us to think about the word there. Okay, the word there is daulu. Okay, is how you would say the Greek word. I'm not a Greek speaker. Okay, I didn't take Greek classes, but I've studied a lot of some software. I've got a lexicon that helps me out with this stuff. Okay, it means to enslave, literally or figuratively, bring into bondage, make or become a servant. I want you to think about the context of what we're talking about here, and I want you to think about the fear that Christians would most likely be having concerning their marital relationship here, especially if they have an unbelieving spouse that says, you're not going to bring that Christian stuff into my home. If you think about even, especially the context, let's say that the wife becomes a Christian, but the husband, in the context here of 1 Corinthians, the husband is a pagan. And he says, we're not doing that here. You know, you can quit that, or you can leave, or you can quit that, or I'll leave. Okay. What is the spouse trying to do whenever they say something like that?
That's
Trying to-
intimidation.
Uh-huh. Tyler, were you going to say something too?
It's just you're trying to make the believer an unbeliever, and that you're called to serve God first and foremost,
Uh-huh.
and that's not to say that divorce is able to happen here. It's just saying that you're called to peace. That maybe they'll come back later, but it's
Yes.
you're not supposed to leave Christ just because your spouse doesn't want to follow the same.
Very good. Okay. That's exactly what we need to understand about the context here, because that was a real thing. I mean, if you think about on a larger scale, what was happening, once Christianity became an enemy to Rome. Okay. Not because Christianity did anything wrong or bad. It was just, they didn't like Christians. And by the time you get to the context of a lot of what's going on in Revelation, the Romans were pretty hard on Christians, even serving them edicts saying, denounce Christianity now, or you're going to be sorry. Okay. So that's happening here in these relationships, in these marital relationships, where one spouse is saying, drop it or it's over. Now, I think it happens in the United States too. I think it happens in the context of today. In our area, especially, I think it happens with extended family. And I know, several of our members that are on here right now watching, they had a pretty tough situation with their families, with their parents, with their brothers and sisters and things like that, whenever they became the black sheep of the family, because they became a New Testament Christian, or because they were converted, okay, and were baptized into Christ. That doesn't sit well with everybody. And sometimes people are even disowned as a result of that. Okay. And so it's a very real thing, that can happen. All right. Any other comments on that one? What I do want to say here is that this idea of the word bondage in verse 15, it translates into a word, like I said, that means enslaved. Okay. And to surrender your Christian principles to keep the marriage together. Okay. Don't do that. Don't do that. Your first allegiance is to be to the Lord. Let's just go over to Acts 5 and verse 29 to kind of back that up. Acts 5:29, and I'll just have somebody pick that up for me and read it if you can do that.
I've got it, Ryan.
Okay.
But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men.
Okay. Pretty simple, right? Pretty simple passage. And of course, that is where Peter and the other apostles were being told by the Jewish leadership, y'all need to be quiet. Okay. And why were they saying that? You know, why were they saying, you guys need to be quiet? You guys need to shut up.
Well, for one, that the Jesus' apostles were teaching the gospel, and it was kind of counterproductive to the power they had at the time, and they were getting seen for what they were, and they didn't like it, for one.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's exactly right. They didn't like it, and that was the main thing about it. That attitude even goes all the way back to Jesus. Okay, the Jewish authority, okay, the high priests, they couldn't find anything wrong with Jesus, which probably made them even more mad. They just didn't like the guy. They didn't like him because basically what he taught in the end was those guys at the temple have no authority. Okay, all authority belongs to me and my Father, and that's it. Okay, so people in power don't like to hear that they don't have power anymore, and that's just and that's the idea. But that's kind of the ongoing theme with the church in the New Testament. Whenever they had to deal with earthly governments, a lot of the times, right? If you think about even Paul before Herod, and before Felix and Festus, you know, all three of those guys had to hear that their power paled in comparison to Jesus's power and his authority. So they just didn't like that, and so that can be an issue, and that's something that is faced in marital relationships too. Okay, when one spouse wants to control the belief of the other spouse, that's kind of what you run into. That is why we emphasize so much Christians marrying Christians. Okay, because then you don't have that power struggle. You have a mutual agreement and a mutual Christian relationship. Really, you can edify one another in that sense. Whereas basically the exact opposite happens in a marriage where that's not there. Okay, so that's kind of the warning with that. All right, let's take a look at verse 16 again, and then I want to look at 1 Peter. Okay, and we're spending a lot of time in these first few chapters, especially here in chapter 7, but I think it's good to do so. I think we're going to end up having to spend another week next week in this particular chapter, and I'm okay with that. I hope you guys are too. All right, but take a look again at verse 16. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Okay. That's an interesting question for us to think about. All right, and in thinking about what Paul was trying to say here, but I think that Paul was trying to say that you have a chance to be an influence. That's a weird way, in our language, it's a weird way to think about it because it's in question form. All right, but how do you know that you won't be a factor in saving your husband? I want to give another real life example from when I lived in Kentucky. Okay, when I lived in Kentucky, I had a young lady in my youth group whose mother grew up in the church. Okay, was in the church her whole entire life. Her husband was not. And as a matter of fact, he had just, I don't know what all the beefs were, but he had some pretty big beefs with the church. Maybe it was a beef with church in general. Maybe it was the reputation that some church somewhere had gotten with him. I'm not really sure what happened, but what I do remember is that this girl's mom would tell me, please don't call the house, don't come and make a house visit. And we were about to have a graduation thing for all of our seniors and stuff. And I said, well, I want to, mail you all a bulletin because it has all the kids' pictures on it and all that kind of stuff. She's like, no, don't mail a bulletin to our house. That'll just make him mad. Okay. So I'm getting this impression of this guy that, man, he must be the meanest, the meanest guy in the world. All right. So we have a special thing on a Sunday afternoon after church for the graduates. Well, he comes to church that morning and he's there, he comes because of the thing that we're going to do when church is over. And he was so impressed with just how we honored the graduates that he started asking questions. Just started asking questions about, what we do here and observing some differences than what he understood church to be. A couple months later, he was baptized into Christ. Now he serves on the Lord's table and does other things, and just a fantastic. Actually, he's one of those guys that he's just a big, huge teddy bear is the best way to describe him. I couldn't even imagine him being mean to anybody. But I think that just goes to show you, and it's not to say that his wife had all the influence on him. I think him going to church and experiencing that, I think that changed some things with him. But think about how patient of a person that she had to be their entire marriage. She was very patient with him. She didn't push it on him, but she always kept the door open and she always invited him. And she always said, this is where we're going. We would love for you to come. It just so happens he was like, you know what? My wife and daughter have always wanted me to come. I'm going to come on the Sunday that, is one of the last Sundays for my daughter here. And, that set in motion the rest of the story. So again, that's just an example to show what influence that can be. So I want us to keep that in mind. And what I'll do is, what we'll do now is we'll read one more passage to go along with that, and then discuss it a little bit. 1 Peter 3, 1-7. Because I know our time is getting away from us. So if anybody wants to read that, just let me know.
I can if you want, Ryan.
Okay, sounds perfect.
1 Peter 3, 1-7.
1-7, that's correct.
Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold and of putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. For after this manner in the old time, the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, as long as you do well and are not afraid with any amazement. Likewise, you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife, as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered.
Okay. This is one of my favorite verses, and it's actually one of my favorite verses when I do premarital counseling with couples. And some of the couples I do premarital counseling with are the mixed bag, if you will. Okay. One might be a Christian, one might not be. But wow, I mean, this passage has twofold value to it. You know, it tells us how to live with somebody that is an unbeliever. It also tells the man, you know, here's how you need to value, here's how valuable your wife is. Okay, like a fragile vessel. Okay, and that's not demean. I don't think that's demeaning a woman at all. I think that's saying treat her like a princess. All right, she deserves that. All right, but at the same time, do y'all think that we can apply the first few verses here to men also, you know, with obviously within their particular gender roles? I mean, obviously, if a husband is living with an unbelieving wife, it's going to take patience, isn't it? It takes patience, and it takes love, and it takes care. All right, but think about that, especially in light of the story that I was talking about. Now, think about this, especially how it shows it here at the very beginning. It says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, whenever they see respectful and pure conduct." Okay. There's probably a pretty big crowd in our society that would absolutely hate this verse. Okay. Why is that? Not to get political, that's not where I'm going with this. But.
Well, Ryan, I know in verse 4 kind of gets you talking about, is it applicable to men as well? And in verse 4, it talks about being the hidden man of the heart. And that's in reference talking to the woman. So I think it's a mankind kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
In which, you know, either direction that would go.
Yeah, very good. All right. So the heart is important, and how we portray ourselves to our spouse is important. And of course, you know, the Bible talks about the relationship and the roles of a husband and wife within the home. Okay. Husband being the head of the house and all that. And so Peter says, ladies, if you practice these biblical principles before your husband or in front of your husbands, and you show them love and you show them respect in that manner. Obviously, we still have to apply the passage from Acts that we looked at a while ago. You know, we ought to obey God rather than man. But anything that doesn't violate that, you know, we need to have that respect for one another. And again, how also could we apply this? You know, I'm thinking about the roles that are especially mentioned in Ephesians chapter 5, you know, verses 25 through 33. Okay, where it talks about the husband and wife relationship being like Christ and the church, and in the relationship between Christ and the church, you know, we're like the bride of Christ, and he is our head, and we look to him, and we love, obey, and respect him. Okay, but you know, what think about that again, also in the context of this First Peter passage. But going off of it a little bit, how can men do the same with an unbelieving wife?
Well, the first thing would be to lead by example. You're going to attend church, and you're going to pray at meals, and just all the things we normally do. We would take the men would take the lead in that aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very good. Okay, so a man needs, you know, stepping up and being a leader. Obviously, just in everything else it says in Ephesians, It says wives submit to your husbands, but it also says husbands respect your wives, right? Show respect to your wives. And then obviously here it's saying husbands, treat your wives as the weaker vessel. Okay. Treat them with respect. Treat them as they're a part of you. In Ephesians, it talks about, no one ever hated his own body. Of course, obviously that's the normal aspect. A faithful Christian is not going to hate his own body. Therefore, he's not going to hate, and he's not going to neglect, he's not going to abuse his wife because she is one flesh with him. You abuse your wife, you're abusing yourself. Okay. Even if it, maybe that, I don't know if that is the greatest example, because physically, sure, you're not doing that, but spiritually you are. You're contributing to a toxic relationship if you do those things. So yes, men need to lead by example. And the first thing that men need to lead by example in is love. Okay. Especially in the context of, husband being a believer and the wife not. Turn that back around to the wife. Obviously, the wife needs to be an example in love to her husband, especially if they are a non-believer. And who better to show the love of Jesus and that unconditional love of Jesus than the one who is a Christian.
In either case, whichever one is the believer, the main point is, and you'll have the biggest impact if you're a Christian every day,
Mm-hmm.
a week, 24 hours a day, as opposed to being one way one day and 1 day a week and another 6 days a week.
Mm-hmm. And I think this also, as you go down and it talks about the modesty aspect, the main idea of modesty here is talking about in attitude. Okay. That you're not loud, you're not busybodies, you're not talking about that spouse behind their back, you're not downgrading them, downgrading their value. Okay. So it's understanding that even if you have an unbelieving spouse, understanding the value of the relationship that you do have with that spouse. Okay. Because as we said at the beginning of this lesson, that relationship is holy in the sight of God. And you are the one who is bringing that holiness into the relationship. Okay. So that's important. Get my throat all scratchy. Woo. All right. You guys have any other questions or comments? I know it's a little bit after 8. So, all right. If we do not, I do want to thank everybody for joining, and I don't think we have any. I don't think we have any questions or comments on YouTube this time. At least I didn't see any, so I apologize if there were some. I just didn't see any. All
Yeah, we
right.
just got to figure out who Red Cup is,
Yeah.
what
Yep.
country he's from.
Yep. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I didn't hear any, or didn't see any more comments from him after I, asked about him, but so wasn't sure. All right, you guys. Well, we'll end with a prayer, and I can't remember, who did I ask? Who led prayer last week at the end? I'm trying to remember.
I think it was Terry.
Okay, so it was Terry. So, Kib, I guess I'll ask you to lead us in prayer, if that's all right, unless Pat wants to do it. Pat's been up in the corner a little quiet, or he's up in the corner in mine at least.
I'll do it.
All right, so Pat, yeah, go ahead and lead us in prayer. And don't forget Stacy Sheeter's dad, especially.
Yeah, I guess
I'll ask you to lead
us in prayer,
if that's all right.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for our many blessings. Be with those that are sick, whether it's the virus or other illnesses. And we ask the things that we learned this night that they can be used in our lives, and or we can use it to teach other people about you. And we ask to find some cure for this virus that's going around. And we ask that when we are allowed to get together, that we follow the guidelines so we may see one another, stay online. We ask you to be with the medical workers and the truck drivers and whoever else has had to work through this. And we ask you to be with their safety and their families. We ask all these things